Americans were largely excluded from voting. They were subject to a wide variety of discrimination, some of which was like you would go to a restaurant like the Valois or something like Salonica, and if that local guy in Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia didn't want to serve a black person, he could just say, we don't serve black people, or the black people only eat in the back room, or something like that. And the question is, could you do that? And those civil rights laws were written. There was the civil rights law and a voting rights law. Following that movement, there was, of course, the big issues around the Vietnam War. That turned out to be a very big deal, but it wasn't a big debate in the sense that it had lasting impact on the way that our government is organized. But the first three, progressivism, the New Deal, and especially this post-1937 New Deal, and Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, where they undertook a variety of social programs to rehouse people and so forth. Those are a long arc of progressive politics that says the government should play a larger role in your life, and by playing a larger role, it can improve your life and it can make outcomes better for everybody. That was widely accepted. I want you to understand the effect that that has had. If you go back to the 1920s and 30s, even in the early 30s, the government share of the gross domestic product was about 4%. 4%. The federal government share of GDP now is 24%, and if you add in state and local, it's 39%, and it's going toward 40 or 45. These are European numbers. This is, so what I'm saying is that this big arc has been cumulative and sustained, and it's been a big program. Now, what's happened over the last several years has been a financial and economic crisis. The two are related, obviously, that has raised a whole series of issues. The biggest one that you always hear about is jobs. We need jobs. We need the economy to get running. These are all the traditional meat and potatoes of even a small recession, right? We want the, if you're President Eisenhower and there's a mild recession in 1956, your opponent runs, I can get the economy moving again. Okay, so that's not at all unusual. What's different here is that there has been the beginnings of a great debate about these issues on the scale of the three that I just mentioned to you. Okay? And that's why I think you're kind of privileged to live at a time when you can see a very big issue. Feels bad because your mom or your dad may be edgy about employment and so forth, and I understand that. But you're also witness to something that's big, where you can look at the politics, and I want to say what I think the debate is about. I should say that one more thing to set the context. This debate is occurring in the context of the most divided U.S. government, ideologically divided U.S. government we have ever seen, at least in modern times. And the reason I say that is that if you think about the Democrats and the Republicans on Capitol Hill, it is now to the case where they're even the most conservative Democrat is more liberal than the most liberal Republican. Or they may overlap, two or three of them may overlap. But basically, you've now got a Democratic Party on one side and a Republican Party on the other side, where there's only a few people. You could say that Ben Nelson is not much different in terms of his ideological views than, say, Olympia Snow. One's a Democrat, one's a Republican. But other than a very few people in the middle, the two parties are split. How did that happen? It happened because, basically, after the Civil Rights Act of the Great Society, the Lyndon Johnson thing, blacks were able to vote. They voted Democratic, in the South, but they didn't want to vote for the one-party Democrats who were segregationists in the prior South. And there was a fight within the Democratic Party over the character of the Democratic Party. When that fight was largely settled in favor of African Americans and more liberal pro-civil rights people, the Republicans moved in without sort of openly flying a racist banner, but taking advantage of people who were concerned about racial issues and some redistribution issues, and they moved over to the Republican side. So the South, from being conservative Democrats, and by conservative I don't just mean they were free traders, they were low taxers, and they were segregationists. And they moved, those people were just wiped out of the party. And in their place came Republicans. So the Democratic Party no longer had this conservative wing, which had been very, very important. The Republicans in the Northeast had a large movement, the Nelson Rockefeller noblesse oblige Republicans, the people you think of sitting in a room like this at Yale or Harvard, and they were going to become Republicans, not Democrats. They weren't going to be with the Irish politicians in Boston. They were the noblesse oblige Republicans. And those people hardly exist anymore. There are a few of them in Maine and so forth, but those people don't exist. So the Republicans lost its more kind of liberal wing. Even now, there used to be, this used to be a common theme on the North Shore here in Chicago, the people who would represent Winnetka and so forth. They weren't going to elect a Democrat, they would elect a liberal Republican, fiscally maybe moderately conservative, but socially very liberal. Those people, there may be a few of them in Congress, but they're almost all gone. The result is that the two parties are very divided. Okay, so in the context of a recession and very divided government, three big issues, I would say, have come up. And I want to explain what they are, and then I'll fill them out a little bit and then stop and we can have Q&A. Okay, the first, I want to focus on what I would call three bedrock elements of today's debate, leaving aside the question of who can get the economy going again. And you can see Romney's running on sheer competence, not an ideological thing. This was the genius of the Obama campaign. The Obama was the single most liberal voter in the Congress, but he did not run as a liberal like that. He let on some of his views, but basically he ran on a throw the bums out campaign, right? I mean, this is the Bush administration, and they've gotten us into these wars, and they're not managing the economy very well, and now there's an economic crisis. Throw the bums out. And he was able to successfully package that as hope and change. It was throw the bums out, but with a happy face on it called hope and change. And like any good candidate, he was doing the least he possibly could to tie his hands. So what did hope and change mean? Nobody knew. Okay, nobody knew. They just, I mean, how can you be against hope? I'm not. If you were, you'd be hopeless. And how can you be against change in an environment in which the status quo doesn't seem to be working? Okay? So that's what Romney, of course, will try to do the best he can. If he's not pushed very hard in the Republican primary, what he'll try to do is just, I'm a competent guy, throw that bum out, put me in, and I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do, right? Because, and then what Obama will say is, we're going to try to show you that what he would do is stuff you don't like. Okay, so, three bedrock elements. The first, is this a government of limited and defined powers? Okay, that's the Pete Stark question I began with. Is this, or should this be, a government of limited and defined powers? Now, you don't have to be a constitutional first principles person to say that the basic meaning of the U.S. Constitution is that it's designed to limit the role of the government. It's designed to give us a government strong enough to protect us against enemies, foreign and domestic. But beyond that, the role of the government is limited. and the limits are well defined. Now, the whole arc that I have given you of progressivism is trying to say that there's been a political solution, not a constitutional amendment, but a kind of broad political agreement in the country over the past century about what government will now do that's different from what it did in the past. And the question is, can it do that without a political pushback, without people saying, no, the government's doing too much? Okay, so part of that, as you can see, winds into what I was telling you about the Commerce Clause. So what's the role of constitutional limits on government? The second element of that government of limited and defined powers is the role of individual rights. Now I want to say individual rights that you have, that I can't suppress your speech, that you have a right to be a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or a Hindu or, you know, religious freedom, those kinds of things. You and I tend to think of those rightly as our rights. They're not given to us by the government. We have them inherently, is our view. We give the government rights, not vice versa. We don't think of this as the French or the continental Europeans do, as the government has everything and it gives you something. We think of ourselves as having these rights, and we delegate certain powers to the government. Now, but what we tend to overlook in all of this, I think, is that by giving you rights, we limit the role that the government can play. Because if you have rights and all of a sudden I want to do something as the federal government, I'm pretty likely to be stepping on one right or another. I want to tap your phone. Well, your right to privacy. You can debate whether there is such a right in the Constitution and so forth. But I want to prevent you from giving money to a campaign. You want to give $100,000. Well, that's your speech. What about you don't want to give it to the campaign, you just want to run an ad or maybe publish a book in the last weeks of the campaign. You know, Hillary Clinton's a bad person, or Barack Obama's a bad person, or Mitt Romney's religion is a cult, or whatever you've got on your mind. The federal campaign limits, the McCain-Feingold laws, would have prohibited that. Okay, and so the people who, I want you to think about this for a second. If you have rights of free speech that are fairly capacious, then that law couldn't stand, right? So it's not just that you have those rights as an individual. It's also that by having those rights, you inherently limit the scope of government. You see what I'm saying? You have property rights. You have a right to make certain contracts individually. But if the government's going to start regulating things, they're going to be stepping on a number of those. And the question is, can they do that? So I have views about that, but rather than go into them, I'm happy to do it in Q&A, and I'm happy to hear your views. But what I want you to understand is that the stronger these rights are asserted, the more it serves as a way of limiting the scope of government. And in particular, for the New Deal to have succeeded, and you can see this in the healthcare law, they have to constrain your individual economic rights. They simply have to. And a good example, and you could say, I'm on the other side of this issue, but I want you to understand it. You're an adult. Who's over 21 here? Okay, so you're over 21. I offer you $9 an hour to come and work for me. Let's assume you're going to pay taxes. There's not any of those questions. I offer you $9 to work for me, and you and I agree to that. Okay. Now, if there's a federal minimum wage law, and it's higher than $9, the government is saying we can't make that contract. Now, there are some contracts we cannot make. I can't make a contract to sell you cocaine. You can't make a contract to perform sex acts for me. These are against public policy, and those are prohibited. But the question is, on something that's legal, and that we both agreed to as adults, what's the role of the government in prohibiting that? Okay, and those are the big issues that are at stake. Okay, and you can see that even things as straightforward, and we think of as an ordinary policy issue, and some people are for a higher minimum wage and some are for a lower minimum wage. But but I want you to understand that we already had to push back a certain sense of your rights and my rights. This would be voluntary. You could accept the job or not accept it. We had to push those back in order to set even something as simple as, you know, minimum wage. And by the way, we could agree $9 could be agreeable and above the minimum wage. And then next year they raise the minimum wage to $9.25, and I decide that changes our contract. All of a sudden, not by anything voluntarily we've done. And all of a sudden, I decide, well, you're not worth $9.25. I'd rather get a better machine that can perform this or whatever. I'm going to fire you. Now, all of a sudden, you are made worse off. You might be made better off. I might just pay you $9.25 instead of $9, but it's possible I'll just fire you. Okay, so, and if we made the minimum wage $30, you can assume that McDonald's would figure out that it makes a lot more sense to have very high technology machines that do a lot of the things that humans do. Okay, so people respond to these, but the question I'm trying to point out to you is that a lot of your rights and my rights to make a contract and